Good morning, everybody. I'm Jeanne Allen. I am the CEO and founder of the Center for Education Reform. Welcome to our Action Series event today, Saving Catholic Schools, What's Happened and Why It's Important. I'm so delighted to see so many people who are joining us today, many for the first time. This is the 9th event that CER has done since COVID became a reality. And we went from working to expand opportunity innovation for kids across the country and schools in person to doing it remotely. And so each week we have hosted and brought to people across the country and internationally stories and leaders who are doing exceptional things in and around education. And I am so pleased that we will be joined shortly by Paul Escala to start from Los Angeles Diocese of Catholic Schools, and then Tom Carroll from Boston. Before I do, I'd like to call on my associate, Michael Musante, Executive Vice President of CER, a longtime collaborator of ours. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Jeanne Allen.
And Michael, like I, both take this issue incredibly personally as well as professionally. Professionally, we at CER believe every child should have access to the opportunity that best suits them. And I know all of you out there watching and participating agree. Personally, it is something that we have seen time and time again, people in our own families benefit from. And so I put that out there because it is so critical that we use what we learned today to take action to ensure that no tool in our toolbox, right, Michael, goes unused.
Yes, no arrow in the quiver, no potato in the bag, whatever the saying may be. But yes, it is very personal. I have a soon-to-be 16-year-old daughter in a wonderful, that you're familiar with, wonderful all-girls Catholic college prep high school here in Washington, D.C., and my son attends an archdiocese school here in Washington, D.C., St. Peter's. Little shout-out to St. Peter's. But yes, especially when it comes to basing a choice on religious freedom and the desire to have a faith-based education as well. And to deny that would be something terrible, which I think leads to something you wanted to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. And so before we go to our first guest, let's talk really quickly and make sure that we level set knowledge out there. So first, why this is important now more than ever, and we'll talk about this with our guests in a couple of moments. By the end of the month, some of you may know, a decision in the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue, considering the constitutionality of the Blaine Amendment, is imminent. And we, among many other groups, filed an amicus brief on behalf of several people arguing that it is a parent's right to direct the education of their child. If the court should rule in favor, Michael, of Espinoza, Kendra Espinoza, and the parents, what can people who believe that religious freedom and education is important expect to do or know?
Yes, so I think it's critical that people out there throughout the states, especially those states that have Blaine amendments on their books, which are based in bigotry, mostly anti-Catholic bigotry from the 19th century, what they can do is, first of all, go to our website. We have an entire website devoted to the Espinoza, Montana case. It describes the Blaine amendments. It describes the laws. But the critical thing is, coming off of the Supreme Court decision, we will, hopefully, I think we all realize we're probably going to get a victory, whether it's a narrowly defined or more broadly defined victory is yet to be seen. But once that's out, the important thing is that we start contacting state legislators, state attorneys general, governors, to explain to them this ruling allows for you to finally rid your states of these horrendous bigoted laws known as the Blaine Amendments. And so,
let's just be very clear, which is what has prevented many states from enacting laws that allow a parent to choose a school to send their kids to and that money following kids. So we've communicated with about 100,000 people to date explaining this. We have a toolkit at edreform.com/Blaine. Do check it out. And then finally, real quick, and we can talk about this later, there's another way for you all to help us help you, and that is to participate in a campaign that we're running right now with a company called Feedback for Good by giving us your opinions on some basic products completely not related to anything having to do with education, just things you buy or like. You can actually raise money for us without having to spend a dime. And so we're going to have that link put in the Q&A. Speaking of Q&A, that's where you put your questions or thoughts. We'll get to them when we can. It's likely that Michael will come back and join us after we've talked to Paul initially and after we've talked to Tom Carroll, the superintendent of Boston, and then we'll take your questions. We'll try to get to them as we can.
And
Straight?
also, Jeanne, we are going to put our links. We've already got a couple questions about putting our link to our Blaine website up as well, and we will do that. And please reach out if you have any questions. Happy to discuss that.
Okay, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Let's bring on our first guest, who I'm delighted to introduce to you, Paul Escala, Superintendent of Catholic Schools for the Archdiocese of LA. Mr. Escala has experience, amazing experience working in public charter and now coming to Catholic schools in LA since gosh, for the last several years, right, Paul?
Actually, good morning, Jeanne. I actually started my new role back in August of 2019, so I'm about 10 months in now.
Wow, and so talk about baptism by fire, right? So you join this enormous system, if you will. You're there, and then your first school year gets interrupted by COVID. And I got to tell you, folks, ladies and gentlemen, just in terms of Michael and I prepping with Paul, and I hope you don't mind me calling you Paul, just in terms of prepping with you, hearing what you did to code shift immediately to be providing education digitally and remotely, it's a wonder. I mean, you've worked in, as we said, public, charter, you have been part of Hahara Institute fellow. I mean, how did this happen? So tell us what happened, and then I want to get to know you a little bit more better too.
Sure. Well, it wasn't me. It is really the essence of Catholic education, our community, a community of families, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, teacher ministers, school leaders, and students all rallying to recognize that their community needed to quickly adapt. And that adaptation happened extraordinarily quickly. It wasn't a straight line for everyone. We had really focused in on where we could ensure that students were receiving equity in terms of acquisition of technology. So over 20,000 iPads were distributed to our students, and where we found gaps, we filled them through philanthropy. We're able to exercise that rather quickly. So many of our schools had some level of technology adaptation in the classroom after many years of investment over time. So parents acted quickly, schools acted quickly, and our office went into action. And as a result of that community effort, we were able to make this change happen.
So I want to just go back a little bit to your background, because you said something to me, and I want to impress upon people why we're even talking about Catholic schools. We have talked about charter, we've talked about private. We give short shrift to Catholic schools, and right now there's a real challenge at the national level, let's be honest, with money not flowing or not being necessarily committed yet to students and needs of kids that are in Catholic schools, which is really interesting because, as you said to me, Paul, COVID doesn't know public or private. And you said you would not be here speaking to us today if it were not for Catholic schools. So tell us about that, and let's try to connect the dots with folks who, including federal and state policymakers, on our event today to help them understand why they should break through the status quo on this.
Indeed. Oh, thank you. So I'm a product of Catholic schools. My mom raised me as a single mom, and with the grace of God in my family, she made sacrifices to exercise her choice as a parent. Growing up in the harbor area of Los Angeles, options were nearly nil. It was the local public school that did not have, unfortunately, a great reputation and unable to really provide the kind of education that my mom and my grandparents really wanted me to have, a Catholic education rooted in Catholic values, but moreover, a chance to end the cycle of poverty, which is exactly what parents in this country have demanded over the years. And over my experience, my life experience in Catholic parish school, high school, and on to college, recognizing that education is the true great equalizer in society. It is what differentiates us from everyone else. And when we are unable to provide that level of equalization in our schools, we undermine the American dream. We undermine the American promise. And quite frankly, we all have to ask ourselves, particularly now at this moment when we are at the precipice of working across all lines to end racial injustice. It starts in the classroom, and it started with me as a person of color, being raised by a single mom who made a choice. And for the millions of other families and mothers and fathers and grandparents all who want their grandchildren, their children to have a better life, to move up that social ladder in the United States of America. Why do we as Americans continue to allow the current funding system to exist, the public utility system of school districts in America, where depending on your zip code, your life may in fact be predetermined? That's not America. And you talk about the Blaine Amendment, we talk about really why Catholic schools started to begin with, because of deep discrimination in public schools. And Catholics were not welcomed in public school. Their faith values were not welcomed. And so many Catholic leaders, clerics, created Catholic schools in order to offer an alternative. And over the many, many years, we have seen that the ability to remain affordable and accessible to many children, particularly those of immigrant, of color, and poor, becomes further and further impossible for them to afford. And those tensions are being lived every single day across this country. So we do have to ask ourselves, what kind of country do we want? What kind of educational system do we want? Do we want to retain the public utility model of public education, or do we want diversification? Do we want equity? Do we want choice? Do we want parents to be able to decide where their children go to school? My mom did. She made great sacrifices. I'm eternally grateful for her sacrifice, and many other families should be allowed to make that choice as well.
And look where you are, right? And you were the chief of staff to the Secretary of Education in California. You're president of your alma mater. I mean, Paul, you've got 80,000 students, right? 80,000 students in 51 Catholic high schools, 213 elementary. You were bigger once, as for so many dioceses. It's about power, right? And as you well said, particularly today with these tensions and with the challenge of bigotry all around us, to not give students the power to make a change. And so I'm struck by the fact that there aren't leaders in Congress and every governor out there rushing to say, how do we not just prop you up given what happened, but how do we continue to truly work on equity, which is what a parent and a community and a child most needs, right? And so it can't be because you don't do well, right? So what are your stats about how your kids do?
Well, you know, I think again, this is where we have over time as a ministry, as a school system, if you will, have been able to overcome immense challenges. The challenge of finance, for example, where At this moment, school districts across the country are seeing their budgets being slashed considerably. When we compare ourselves locally to our public school peers, we're seeing about a per pupil cost of about $6,100 per elementary school student, whereas our local peers on average are seeing about a $13,000 per pupil cost. But the cost itself is not as much as what, if you think about how much the income that you receive. So for example, we generate about somewhere around $5,000 to $5,500 per student. That's not just tuition, that's fundraising. Again, compared to public peers, it's considerably more in terms of state and even federal funding for per child. So the differential on cost is extraordinary. The income is extraordinarily different, but yet we see incredible academic outcomes. So for example, 51% of our students are meeting or exceeding the 65th percentile in reading and math. So we compare that with our public peers, and it runs the gamut, but I think it's clear to say that we're doing more with less. That's the bottom line. We're seeing over 80% of our students go on to college, and 95% persistence rate in college compared to a 75% average among our public peers in college.
And by the way, not to interrupt you, that 78% are students of color, 90% qualify for free and reduced lunch, and you guys actually started serving over 18,000 meals immediately.
We did. We started, it's interesting, we started day one, a few days into the crisis, serving about 7,500 meals initially. And that has grown to now over 18,000 meals at 40 different school sites. And that's being done as a result of the National School Lunch Program, which our students qualify for. We're serving the poor. We're serving the poor every day. We've served over 500,000 meals across those 40 school sites every day. So we are serving a public good. We're not asking where those kids went to school. We're not asking them where they live. It is on their honor, and the demand, unfortunately, as you see that number increase, tells us a lot about where families are at currently in this crisis. They are hungry, kids are hungry, and we're going to feed them.
So what do we do from here? Do you guys go back to normal, or are you thinking about innovation? Because now we not only have a Catholic system like yours and many others that are struggling, that were struggling before COVID. Now we're struggling even more. Now we have this economy crashing around us. Philanthropy is going to be down. People's pocketbooks are going to be reduced. So, and yet here's this valuable, critical tool, as we talked about earlier. So is there a silver lining here? Is there some way that we go from, struggling to being back on top with these schools?
Yeah, absolutely. Normal is relative. What was normal yesterday is not normal today or tomorrow, and so I don't use that necessarily as a benchmark for what tomorrow will look like. Tomorrow is going to be predicated on the needs and demands of children and families. Period. End of story. And what we've experienced as Catholic schools in America is America's story. We've been knocked down, we've gotten back up. When we've been challenged, we've risen to the occasion. We are a resilient community. And you can ask anybody who ever went to Catholic school, they will tell you that, it was tough, I was challenged, and as a result, I'm a stronger person. And now that's not a straight line. Everyone's got a different experience. And I had challenges as well in school. But overall, what our story is the American story. And we want resiliency in our kids. We want grittiness. We want perseverance. And that's exactly what our schools, our leaders, our ministers are going to do. And that's what they've been doing every single day. And I see it every day, Jeanne, in my own kids. I've got an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old, both of which are doing distance learning at their Catholic school. And we're watching them go through these motions, these challenges. They will face them coming back in the fall. And what we've told our schools, our communities, is our goal is to return in person in the fall. We just saw over the weekend a release of new guidelines from the state public health department. We are translating those locally with our partners in public health here at the counties.
What kind of guidelines? Because those are going to be a big challenge, right? What kind of guidelines are you seeing for return?
Yeah, so really three critical areas, and this is kind of where we're narrowing everything down. When you really focus in on the critical areas and sort of ignore the noise, it's face coverings, it is distancing where possible, as much as possible, indoors and outdoors. It is really avoiding mixing of kids. So trying to keep kids, in cohorts. Easier at the elementary level than at the high school level, because high schools have a far greater diversification of courses and kids mix a lot. The other area is what we always do in schools, and especially at the primary levels, which is wash your hands. A lot of hand washing, a lot of hand sanitizer. And so I look at this as a modification to what we have had in schools forever. And it's going to be more distancing. We've been talking a lot and doing a lot of collaboration, a lot of group work over the years. We've gotten smarter about how kids learn together, peer to peer and in small group. That's going to look different. We're not going to have as much as that. So pedagogical shifts are going to change. In terms of schedule, I've been hearing a lot about multi-track, and some kids are on one day, some kids are off the other, and even having dual track per day. It's really going to depend on every school. It's going to depend on enrollments. It's going to depend on physical capacity and staffing. But overall, again, I see our schools rise to the occasion, and I see parents really wanting to know what we're going to do to ensure safety. But because we're a community, we're asking each other that. So we're asking parents, will you take your kids' temperature before they come to school? Make sure that you're practicing good hygiene at home. This is an us conversation. This is not me versus you and what we're going to do. It's what we're going to do together. And I think that is really where we're going to see the translation of better hygiene and health and safety, and marginalizing the risk of transmission. We will not eliminate it. Just like we don't eliminate colds and flus and other bugs that float around schools. This one's a different one. But we're going to ensure that we can offer the very best while maintaining a in-person instructional environment.
And what does your digital learning plan look like? I mean, are you right now, did you just take everything you were doing and put it online? Were you already online? And talk to us about the challenges of a highly transient, low-income community and devices, because this has come up on everything. So I know you mentioned that you really helped get devices into people's hands, internet, etc. What are you doing so content and devices and kind of hardware? What's the answer to that now? Because you all might go back, like so many places, and then there could be a resurgence. Is there a way that we can emphasize to parents and community leaders that you will be there and you will be taking care of these kids no matter what? You're not going to skip a beat.
Yeah. Well, I think the proof's in the pudding. If you see what we have done, I think our parents know on the whole what we were able to accomplish within 72 hours. Our schools did not miss a beat. Our teachers kept teaching, our kids kept learning, and we anticipate all of the learning that we did as a system of schools. And remember, we're not a school district. By nature, Catholic schools are locally controlled. Catholic schools are responsive to their local community. They are mostly parish schools. They are relatively small and highly personalized already. We know our kids. We have a relationship with our parents. So I think that is a strong baseline when you consider the disruption that's caused by a quick turnaround. So now as we look forward, yes, Jeanne, I mean, we are telling every school, prepare for both. prepare for in-person with those modifications, but also prepare for distance learning in the event that we hit another period of safer at home orders. And so what are we doing to address inequities in terms of technology? As I mentioned, that deployment, that initial deployment of iPads, identifying where the gaps were, filling those gaps with additional devices for kids was our response to ensure that every kid had a device in hand. As we look towards the summer, we're going to ask our principals again what schools might be lacking devices after this school year, and can we backfill to make sure that when we go into the fall, those kids have devices. Now, the last question you mentioned is sort of platforms and what schools are using. We're seeing a highly diversified application of different modalities, different software that schools are using. And again, because we are responsive to local community needs, we're not prescribing or dictating one way of doing things. We're looking for exemplars. We're looking for peers within school leadership to share with other peers about what's working and what's not, leveraging Google Classroom or Schoology or even Microsoft Teams, and how teachers relate to one another and plan. So all of those varied platforms are being used. And what we're doing at the Department of Catholic Schools for the Archdiocese is providing the professional development, ongoing professional development. And our school leaders and our teachers have been extraordinarily responsive. Not every teacher knew how to flip a classroom, right? And so when you're going from an in-person model to a full virtual digital space, you can't just take your in-person classroom pedagogy and apply it to the distance environment. So many of our teachers had to adapt and have continued to adapt. But as we get those surveys back and we start to listen to our teachers, we've seen a level of responsiveness being very high for adaptation. It takes time, it takes practice, there's no question. But again, we're a resilient community, and people have responded in the best way possible to address the needs of kids.
So Paul, you had a slide. Do we want to show that, or have we already covered it? Why don't we pull the slide up and we can keep talking. So one of the things that, okay, so again, let's just do highlights here. Largest Catholic school system in the US, amazing. And third largest system in California, spanning 3 counties, that's pretty amazing. 78% underrepresented minorities, we talked about that. We talked about tuition, response to the crisis. This is what I think is amazing. 96% of elementary and high schools have reported active learning and communications with students and families.
Yes, indeed. And you know, I think this is again another example of where when you have parental choice and parental buy-in, you see the responsiveness. People have an investment. Every student in our schools pays a discounted tuition. You know, people ask me, well, how many of your kids are on some level of assistance? Every one of them, no matter what, who they are, because we're raising money on top of whatever tuition is. We see a highly diversified school community mirroring Southern California, mirroring America as we continue to grow as a nation and see the diversification. So we see this great level of success among our students academically, spiritually, character. We're doing it at a fraction of the cost. We're saving, Catholic schools on the whole here in California are saving the California taxpayer $2 billion a year. And in a world where we're seeing a $56 billion deficit in California state budget, and recognizing the incredible impact that's going to have on public education, if our kids were to essentially stop going to our schools, right, that would add only to a growing deficit here in California. So we see our work as being a public good and diversification.
Well, and let's stop on that. So public good, diversification of offerings, saving taxpayers right now. Let's also put a fine point on this to make sure everybody understands that there is a battle right now going on nationally about whether your schools will qualify. So there's two kinds of potential funding streams. One is existing proportional funds that came from the stimulus bill post-COVID that Congress has allocated. And the debate about that, I want you to quickly talk about. And then secondly, the new potential stimulus. Many are saying Catholic schools, private schools should not get that money. Again, COVID did not know public or private. So if you don't get it and your students don't get it, who gets that? And then how do we square that with justice and equality?
Yeah. So
Kind
real
of a
quick,
loaded question for you, but go ahead. I teach you.
yeah, no, I'll respond really quickly, and I thank you for the question because you know, you don't have to be a policy wonk to recognize that when it comes to protecting children, no matter where they go to school, no matter what choice their parents made, we need to protect all kids. We're not just protecting those kids, we're protecting our neighborhoods, our communities, our families, all of them. We have mixed families. We have some families who send their kids to public school or a public charter school and also to a Catholic school. This virus knows no boundaries, doesn't care what school you go to, doesn't care what political persuasion you have. So the idea that we would not exercise the full weight of the taxpayers' capacity insofar as the CARES Act to ensure proportional share of personal protective equipment is just another example of the rancor and the politics that have entered into this. And frankly, greed, for lack of a better term, when it comes to what's mine and what's yours. This isn't about Catholic schools, Lutheran schools, Jewish schools, public schools, charter schools. This is about kids. And I haven't met a single parent when I asked them about this, you know, saying, gosh, you know, I think public schools should get more funding to support protective equipment that can keep this virus at bay. It's a no-brainer. It's common sense. But here we are talking about proportionality versus Title I eligibility. And we all know in private schools, depending on your local education agency, who's not necessarily welcoming to provide you the maximum eligibility for poor kids, Title I, Title II, III, and IV all are administered differently across LEAs across the nation.
Exactly.
We had challenges with our local educational agencies here in Southern California in many respects who fight us tooth and nail on Title I eligibility. That means even fewer kids, poorer kids, will not get their share of these dollars. So we're very concerned about this, and we know that this is not the end. California did take a position on this late Friday. They are going to align with Title I eligibility. That was a big decision that was made, so I suspect this will end up likely in the courts.
All right, well, Paul, you have been fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to ask Paul to sit on the couch for a minute, and we're going to bring in our next amazing guest, which is his colleague, Tom Carroll, who does a similar job across the country for Boston Catholic schools. So let's highlight Tom and say good morning. How are you, Tom? Welcome.
Good morning. How are you?
Fine, thank you. So for those of you who do not know, Tom Carroll, Superintendent of Catholic Schools for the Archdiocese of Boston, has over 2 decades of policy advocacy experience and has spent about the past 20 years, actually I think it's more, Tom, you're trying to be young in your bio, on school choice education opportunity. He has been based in New York, helped bring about charter schools, greater support for Catholic schools, more options, tax credit programs, and today he leads a diocese that includes 112 schools serving over 30,000 students, and the progress and the outcomes for those kids are absolutely extraordinary. So welcome. Let's get down to business here. I want to bring you into the tail end of the conversation with Paul and talk about what's happening at the federal level before we dig into the Boston schools and how you guys shifted during COVID.
Sure. So at the federal level, what we're facing all across the country, and Paul's seeing it in Los Angeles, I'm seeing it in Boston, we're seeing it. I know I'm originally from New York. I'm a lifetime New Yorker, and the New York Archdiocese is going through this as well. But literally all across the country, which is we don't have a shortage of people who want to send their kids to our schools. What we're facing right now is enough parents who have the economic capacity to send their kids to our schools. And what happened is really simple. The government, on its own, closed down the economy, put aside the public health issues, but it closed down the economy for an extended period of time. And we now have unemployment that is close to approaching Great Depression levels of unemployment. And you have a lot of people who, even if they're not unemployed, they're underemployed because their hours, if they're hourly workers, have been cut back substantially. So for poor parents, economically disadvantaged parents, working class parents, middle income parents, they've been hit really, really hard by the economic devastation caused by the government shutdown. And so people who already have their children in all of our schools across the country no longer have the ability to pay. And the problem that gives is we both in Boston and LA raised a substantial amount of money for scholarships, but it is a tuition-driven system. We can't run Catholic schools if not enough people can pay tuition. So we have a lot of schools that we simply don't have enough money to pay the teachers for a full year of instruction. So that's a huge problem because you obviously can't start a school year knowing that your economic premise is you're asking the teachers to basically donate a half year's worth of their time because you can't pay them. I just don't think that's a moral thing to do. So I believe that we're going to have the largest number of Catholic school closures across the country in anybody's recent memory. And so it's obviously Catholic schools, the enrollment for broader cultural reasons, the over-secularization of society and so forth. We've had generically roughly a 3-4% decline every year. But we're already in a situation where we've announced closures already for roughly 10% of our schools. And I fear that there's going to be, people talk about kind of the brain drain, the summer brain drain. Kids, lose a lot of the information they learned during the school year over the summer. There's another summer trend that we have to worry about, which is the summer enrollment slide. A lot of businesses are artificially employing people because they're frankly being bribed by the Paycheck Protection Program. So in order to get those loans they got from the SBA, they have to maintain their existing payroll through sometime in July or so. And so soon as that time period's over and they go to get forgiveness for the loan, a lot of those people are suddenly going to be unemployed. So the unemployment rate, which is astonishingly high, is going to go even higher because of that. And then the reopening of the economy is going much slower than everybody had hoped for, including the President of the United States. So because of that, people who thought they had a temporary problem and it was going to get better this summer when the virus abated, still are unemployed, or new people are getting layoff notices or having their hours cut back. Because if you're in a restaurant, even if it's open doing outdoor service, it may not have indoor seating. There's just going to be a lot less work for people. And so as that ripples through the summer, you're going to have a problem. The third, and Paul talked a little about what the fall will look like. I'm not sure all parents are going to be thrilled about kids all being 6 foot apart, less kids per classroom. People always want small class sizes. But it means in some schools that some kids on an alternating basis are going to have to be at home, which means they're going to be getting their instruction live streamed. Now, there are advantages to that. Like you could be 15 feet from your refrigerator, right? It's just kind of like you go to a football game. Sometimes it's better to watch it at home. But I think for parents who are both working, once they stop working remote, it's going to be a huge problem for people, particularly if you have single moms who are trying to work, and particularly if you have younger children. So they can't go to the public school and get a different deal because the public schools are overcrowded and the public schools will have the same public health standards. But the question is, are people going to be willing to pay for the honor of this unusual situation? So we don't know the answer to all these questions, but we do know people are going to lose jobs when paycheck protection goes out. We know more people are going to lose their jobs naturally over this summer because the economy is not picking up fast enough. And we know some portion of parents, we don't know the exact number, are just going to walk away because if they've got to pay for childcare, they can't pay for tuition. So these are all bad signs, which segues into the advocacy piece, which is simply, and I started as a libertarian, but I've changed since I've taken this job. And I've seen this crisis. But they caused the problem, the they being the government. We didn't shut down the economy, they did. And so it's almost like you take somebody's property under the Constitution. There's a takings clause. You've got to reimburse people for the property you took. So here what they did, they shut down the economy. They're causing the collapse of Catholic schools. is a direct cause and effect. And I think it's on them when they do the next relief package to make sure there's money in there. Not for schools. I'm not trying to save institutions. I'm trying to save families. And I think the aid that comes through should be directed at parents. So parents who want to send their kids to Catholic school. And I'm not talking about shifting lots of people from public schools. I'm talking about an emergency measure to make sure that everybody already in the school or were planning on sending their kids to school, that they have the ability to do what they always wanted to do. And the only reason they don't have the ability is because it was robbed by the government. So I think they need to make these people whole. And I want the money, in my view, should be given in the form of scholarship aid, which could be routed through governors and then off to the scholarship funds that we have set up across the country.
Totally fair and very, very interesting point, which is, again, regardless of whether that was the right thing to do or not, which most of us believe it was, they caused it, they have to help fix it. And you know, so there are a couple of things. One is to make sure that everyone who is interested in this issue understands what their power is, right? Because part of the reason that, and let's just be really blunt, that's what we do here at the Center for Education Reform. We're watching Capitol Hill. We're watching state legislatures. Guess who's going up there saying Catholic schools and private schools shouldn't be part of this? It is the status quo. It is the people who believe that somehow it's pernicious to support those kids. So it is the NEA, it is the AFT, and this is not a partisan issue anywhere in your cities or schools, but it's a partisan issue there. And so
But
again,
what I should say though, if you looked at what the House version of the relief bill, which was passed a couple weeks ago, they had $60 billion in there for K-12 education. They had a couple provisions in there to stick it to non-public schools. Okay, but if there's going to be, and Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, has said in a press conference in Kentucky that the jobs package from the relief package from the Senate perspective is going to be all about kids and jobs. Okay, so, and the President of the United States, in a call that Paul was on, because he was one of the presenters, along with my Cardinal O'Malley, and with Archbishop Gomez, and with Cardinal Dolan, was very clear that he was personally invested in trying to find a way to save Catholic schools. So you have the speaker saying she wants to do something for education. You have the Senate Majority Leader saying they want to do something for kids.
Right.
And you have the president being even more specific that he'd like to save Catholic schools and other non-public schools during this crisis. So I think there's a consensus of something needs to be done. And my view is really simple. If something's going to be done on K-12, the non-public schools and the Catholic schools are the biggest providers, if you will, the biggest chunk of that. Non-public schools educate roughly 10% of the kids in the country. So I'm just saying, whatever amount of money they spend, whether it's 60 billion, 40 billion, 100 billion, I don't care, you know, that's going to be decided by a bunch of politicians, not by me or Paul.
10%. It should be 10%.
We should get, it's kind of like get 10% tithe. So as Catholics, we kind of are familiar with that number. But I think they should, in the relief bill, they should set aside 10% for non-public schools. And if they do that, I think it will avoid a lot of schools from closing this fall. And they will be directly helping a lot of kids. And just to make, I don't know if Paul has any politics in his background, but I do. But if you look at the Catholic vote, there's a lot of key Senate races, and there's obviously a lot of key electoral states. And the Catholic vote, and also the Jewish vote, and the Jewish community has the same, and the evangelical vote, they all have the same interest in this issue. And so there are a lot of states in which, if you want to carry it as a U.S. senator, or you want to carry a congressional district, or you want to get elected president, that you have to be mindful of the power of the Catholic vote, the Jewish vote, and the evangelical vote. That's just a plain fact.
Yeah,
and on the Catholic side, because we're a universal church.
Hang on, before you go on. So, but I want to stop you there though, because you're talking about what's possible and what should happen. And we have a lot of people who are actually asking this question and want to know out there that don't know what you and I know, which is that there's actually a challenge to making that happen, right? So one of the questions was, do you have any indication that we will get the support, right? That we will get the support for all of your schools, those who support these opportunities. And that's the rub, that apparently there's a tremendous amount of opposition. And so the question is, how do we game the percentage, right? How do we ensure that this does happen?
So I think, look, we serve an awful lot of people. And we are the margin for a lot of the political people. And the Catholic vote is not a Republican bloc. So the people that the teachers unions have the most influence over nationally is the Democratic Party. Okay. If you go to LA, New York, Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, the Catholic vote's largely a Democratic vote. So what we're talking about is they need to be mindful. I mean, you think go to Scranton, the Catholic vote's a Democratic vote, where Joe Biden's from. So a lot of the states that Trump wants to win, the Catholic vote will decide the outcome here. So I think both parties have an interest. They know that it could be the key swing vote in this election, and they should pay attention to that. My current job is not politics. I'm just stating just the facts of electoral politics in this country. But I think they should do it because it's the right thing to do. They caused a problem. I think they should make it right. They did damage to these families, and they're about to do substantial damage to their children. And they have an easy way to fix it. And if they're going to help out K-12 schools, I think it's unconscionable to say, from a moral perspective, that some children are more valuable than other children. So if you go to a public school, somehow you're more valuable, like in the eyes of God, than if you go to a Catholic school. We should be taking, I'm not saying just help Catholic schools. I want all the children in the country, no matter what place their parents chose for them to get an education, to be able to get through this crisis one way or the other. And I'm just saying, don't leave anybody out.
And I would push back when you said, well, I don't do politics, I'm a superintendent. You're both doing politics, just like your average school superintendent in a district has to do politics every day. He or she goes to play golf with the local state legislator. Every day that they talk to the press. Every day, put Paul back, by the way.
Look, I do advocacy, but I don't do electoral politics in the job. I'm not out campaigning for one candidate or the other. I don't endorse those individual candidates.
But the point is, you have to make the point that there has to be a voice. And so whether it comes too late or hopefully it won't come too late, there has to be a voice. And so we're about not just having a conversation, we're about impact. You guys are making an impact with kids and students. Your teachers are, your schools are. Now your parents and those teachers and those students have to make the same kind of impact that thousands all over the country are right now making in the streets. So imagine if that voice of all of those people rallying against injustice could come up today.
Sure. The beauty of this moment is the relief bill is going to be passed either before July 4th or the middle of July. We're not asking people to join a crusade that's going to go on for years and years and years. There's a time-limited opportunity to get in the middle of what probably will end up being a $2 trillion bill, which is staggering when you think that the federal budget's only $1.5 trillion. And I'm not sure where all this money's coming from, but be that as it may, all people have to do, because nobody can really lobby the way that we used to lobby because of the restrictions on public spaces and congregating and all that kind of stuff. But people literally, all they have to do is pick up the phone and call their congressman or the US senator or the White House and let them know with great passion. We're not talking about it has to be a polished, perfect speech or whatever. Be authentic and tell them what the schools mean to your children and why you want them saved. And the more authentic and the more personal you are about what the impact Catholic schools have made on your sons or your daughters, the more compelling it will be to the congressman or senator or the person at the White House who takes your phone call. But
and
this is not the time.
What about your governors? Charlie Baker, Gavin Newsom, what about your governors? What do they and can they do to make sure that we get these gaps closed and that the schools continue to stay open? As someone just pointed out, there's almost 100 that will have been closed by the fall if we don't stem the tide, although I would argue that a lot of dioceses out there need to stop closing and instead consult with people like us on what innovations you could deploy until you do that, because that does exist. But anyway, what about the governors?
Well, so immediately the governors can do two things. One is the CARES Act money, and this varies by state. So in New York, for example, the money that was supposed to flow through the districts and help them out with coronavirus-related expenses is not flowing through. In Massachusetts, it is, and that's because the governor is following the guidance of the U.S. Secretary of Education. he's not taking an adversarial position. So he's already in the right place in that. Second, in the case of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, he has, from the federal government, I'm sure that the number in California is dramatically higher because we're a much smaller state, but he has roughly $50 million in discretionary money that he has to spend on early childhood, K-12, or higher education. So he has an allocation decision across those three sectors, and then he has to decide what purposes the money's spent on. So I expect that decision's going to be made soon, and a bunch of people have weighed in with him on that. We had, I don't know, 50,000 plus signatures on a petition and so forth. And a number of people have spoken to him directly about that. And then third, for any elected official who has the ability to reach somebody in Congress, so whether it's whether it's the mayor of Boston, the mayor of LA, or just a governor, whatever it might be, they have the ability to get their phone calls returned pretty quickly. So if somebody happens to know somebody, and sometimes it's, the congressman kid is in your school, or your son may be on his baseball team or whatever. People have to think through kind of what relationships they may have. And anybody, the audience here are people who belong to the House of Representatives, people who are U.S. senators, or the White House. So anyone you know who could get to any of those people, whether it's a donor, whether it's a friend of a friend, whether it's a coworker, whatever it might be, could be the boss at the company you work with, or it could be anything. It could be the person who cuts the congressman's hair, at a barbershop. Anybody who has the ability to reach that person, you should try to get them to on your behalf. But you still have, because the numbers of people, we have millions of people, 1.7 million people in Catholic school. That's a lot of people.
A lot. If they all reached out, if they are 10 people in their closest family unit reached out, it reminds me, Thomas, you're talking about the great story. Of course, you were very instrumental in helping enact substantial reforms in New York when people said it couldn't be done. The dentist to a state superintendent of public instruction, Oklahoma, convinced her when she was working on her mouth that she needed to enact reforms. I mean, things happen in stranger ways. Hey, Paul, let me bring you back in for a second. How about your governor? You're in a big state. They say, as California goes, so goes the nation. He's incredibly popular in the Democratic Party. Can we have Governor Newsom weigh in?
Yeah. Just to build on Tom's point in answering your question, Jeanne gave you an example of the level of advocacy that we're doing with the governor's office. We were part of the California Association of Private School Operators, was on the phone with a member of Governor Newsom's staff last week talking about the CARES Act and ESSER funds and equity there. Here in California, we have an interesting body politic. There is a constitutional position of the Superintendent of Public Instruction that is independently elected and runs the California Department of Education. So that constitutional position ultimately made a decision that the governor did not when it came to the allocation methodology. That on paper is how it works, but they all fall under the same sort of partisan alignment. So while the governor's office recognizes the need to ensure, in this case, that personal protective equipment needs to be in the hands of all kids, his office is administering through the California Office of Emergency Services the allocation of an initial 30-day allotment of a PPE equipment. We see that as a good faith effort on the part of the governor, while the Superintendent of Public Instruction did not follow the guidance of the Secretary for Education, Betsy DeVos. So we see an interesting political environment here in California that takes on a bit of a different dynamic. Nevertheless, yes, there's a great deal that can be done by the governor and the legislature. But let me just add one last point, and something that you had mentioned. It's about innovation, and I can speak for myself. We've got to earn it. We've got to earn it. We're not a museum piece, and I'm not looking for preservation in Catholic schools. Catholic schools are resilient, they are persevering, but yes, we are declining. We're declining as the demographic shifts happen, as economic sustainability for American families becomes harder and harder. The redefinition of what poverty means, it's no longer about meeting a federal guideline, especially in expensive communities like Boston and Los Angeles, New York, and others. The working poor is exacerbated, over 50% unemployment. Working people here in the LA County area, for example, have been furloughed or unemployed as a result of this crisis. It is a created crisis, but it doesn't have to be that way moving forward. Catholic schools have to innovate, and part of our work now is how do we employ those innovations? How do we leverage relationships? How do we leverage our ability to work in a highly personalized environment? So adapting to micro-schooling, multi-aging, not because of financial circumstances, but because pedagogically it works, especially in an environment right now. How do we employ greater acquisition of early college opportunities and transferable credit at the high school level? The list goes on and on and on. We need to increase value. We need to increase diversification and differentials in the marketplace so we are attractive to families. Not only those who can afford it, but those that can, and create those access points. And with the partnership of the federal government and at the states level, we can continue to add to that diversified fabric of American education. But again, it comes down to what kind of educational system in America do we want? Do we want the public utility system where it's a monopolization and everybody gets one size fits all depending on your zip code,
Right.
or not? And I think right now we're at a time where people are saying, no, we want something different.
And I think the most important thing is Michael comes in and takes us through these amazing questions here. The point to also emphasize, forgive me if it sounds duplicative, is as we've been going through this since early March in analyzing and being directly in touch with leaders of charter, public, private, it is the schools and organizations like yours that have the most flexibility and freedom that switched within 72 hours, that are calling kids regularly, whose teachers are like learning and crawling to the top, like doing everything they can to serve. And frankly, it is many of those monolithic systems, Paul and Tom, that took like 45 days, even though philanthropists were writing checks for iPads for every single child, for example, in the city of Philadelphia. And so what strikes me as critical is while they all try to figure out how to be more nimble and opportunistic and innovative, we're already doing it in the sectors where people have freedom. So I think that's a really important point as well to point out. Okay, enough about me. Michael, take us through the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I state these questions, Tom and Paul, if you want to just comment on both. Some people are asking LA specific, but we'll expand that into Boston. Could you please give the average salary of teachers in the Archdiocese of LA and Boston? And do you expect the potential for teacher layoffs in either of your archdioceses?
Tom, would you like to start? I can build on it.
Yeah, so on the salaries at the elementary level, it's around 40,000 for teachers, around 64,000 average for high school teachers. We have closed schools, and so whether those teachers get redeployed or not, they have kind of first dibs on other jobs within our system. So I can't answer the question yet of how many people end up unemployed or just get redeployed until it all settles out.
Paul?
Yeah, our range, I would say, at the elementary level could be as low as starting out in the mid 30s, excuse me, upwards into the 50s and 60s. On average, about a third less in terms of straight compensation between our schools and public peers. But it's important to recognize that our teachers are ministers. This is more than a job, this is a vocation. And so many sacrifice for that, but how long can they possibly sacrifice? It is becoming a highly competitive environment, and notwithstanding the crisis, we know that high quality teachers are essential, high quality leaders are essential to have successful schools. So we see a big transition happening in all of our sectors relative to retirements and a new generation coming into our schools. So we see an opportunity with this highly active generation coming in. Social justice is a huge concern, and we see our schools being at the forefront of being open to those folks, but we're going to have to compete for them. Will we see layoffs and furloughs? I suspect we will. It's all going to be depending on how many kids show up in August. Really is going to be the determining factor, but many of our schools have had to reduce staff already
Right.
as they prepare for a post-PPP environment.
You know, one of the things I just want to bring up real quickly is that in our discussions with a lot of other innovative leaders, and something you guys have and the Catholic school systems have, but a lot of charters and traditional public schools don't, is you have access to other facilities, namely churches, rectories, parish halls, etc. And part of the development, the discussion that we're having on the future of school is how you make sure, talk about innovation, that you take the students who can't all be in the same classroom, or maybe you have to stay home, and in order to encourage parents to want to make that sacrifice to send them, maybe there are groups of 10 and 15 in a parish hall in different sections, working with a retired parishioner, working with a college graduate who's not back to work yet, working with a part-time teacher who may have just stayed home to have a baby, but has a couple hours in the afternoon. And so having great digital learning content, deploying that in sort of these, we're calling sort of organized learning communities. Public and charter schools are looking at libraries and community centers for that. You guys have them there in your backyard, and most of the time they're empty if it's not Sunday or like Scouts on Monday night. And so I'm wondering whether or not we can start driving a conversation with leaders like yourself and many of the others, extraordinary influencers on this event today, to start saying, what does innovative Catholic education look like that we could then transport not just through COVID, but it makes you be able to spread out resources, engage a lot more people, and maybe attract more as well.
The silent workforce of Catholic schools are our volunteers. It has been the mainstay. Volunteerism in our communities has been a tremendous value add because we're not just schools, we're communities. We're multiple ministries on a parish. So we are able to do that. I think it's all going to be about that careful balance between exercising that secondary volunteer workforce by also maintaining efficacy to guidelines. You know, we have a high risk population, chronically ill or over 65 workforce that we're concerned about as we think about coming back in, and sometimes those volunteers may fall into those categories. So we're going to have to strike a balance everywhere. It's not going to be a straight line, but you're absolutely right, Jeanne. We have other spaces, we have other folks who can come together in a very innovative way to address the needs of kids.
So, and on that point, Tom, how are you deciding Title I eligibility for the next year? And then Paul, if you could also comment on that, please.
Oh, in what context do you mean?
It sounds like they didn't really put it into any other context. I would assume, though, are you looking at students that you're getting that meet Title I eligibility requirements as outlined, or
funds coming down from the CARES Act, I'm imagining?
Yeah, yes, for the funds that are coming through.
Yeah, I'll defer to Paul on that one. I don't actually not involved in that website.
Well, let me add,
Okay,
Paul.
Yeah, what I could say just in general is that, you know, of course, here in California with this latest ruling, it appears that the instructions to local education agencies, school districts, when working with non-public schools or agencies, is to defer to the Title I eligibility rules, which means far fewer kids will receive adequate resources. That means public schools will receive more from that allotment. But in general, the title programs, again, another area, give you an example. We have a school in one of our counties that was just informed that instead of going through the school district for free reduced lunch program, the school will now have to go out and vend with a third party and pay up front for all of those meals and then get a reimbursement back from the local school district. The local school district knows that those schools are running on margins. Our schools are running on margins. They don't have the cash flow to go out and prepay for months of meals for poor kids. And so what will end up happening is those kids won't get served. Yeah. And again, it's about how do we pull out every nickel and dime, because the way that our system is set up, these inequities are built in to ensure that this level of competition doesn't exist, and it doesn't have to. And even you talk to public school peers and they say, look, this is the way the rules are. I have to get as much for my kids as I can. So it's an us versus them environment that leads to these kinds of injustices and social inequities. We don't have to choose this way, but this is what we are dealing with on the ground.
So our next question, actually, I'm going to go ahead and try to put three of them together. They're similar in a sense. Tom, we're going to let you go first again, if you don't mind. What
Sure.
advice would you give to Catholic superintendents around the country right now? Most of us running schools don't exactly know how we plan to deliver instruction. What strategies are you asking your school leaders to deploy in communicating with families, knowing that you don't have all the answers? And also, have you seen a pause in your upcoming registrations and re-enrollments? How can we assure families that Catholic education will still be waiting without having the funding to back you up?
So basically, contingency for the fall. How do you know what's going to happen in the fall? How are you preparing? What are you seeing?
Right. So for us, the biggest thing I think there's two things that are holding parents back. One is just the economics. They don't know what their own economic situation is. In some cases they do, and they're in a precarious position. I understand that. Other people who haven't been laid off are still nervous that they might get laid off. That's part of it. The other part is people don't know whether we're reopening in the fall. And so do they want to start, in our case, we start the tuition payments in July. So do they want to start making payments in July, not knowing if school's opening in September? So that's why in our state, the governor has indicated he's going to announce that next week, so that parents have a sense of, what they're looking forward to and what it will look like. We're going to be required, as I think in most of the country, kids have to be 6 foot apart. Paul discussed some of this stuff earlier. Kids going to have to wear a mask, even teachers and so forth. They're talking about doing a maximum of 10 kids per class, which I think is a bit much. But at any rate, this is kind of like the set of requirements in one permutation or other are going to be what we're looking at across the country. I think the answer to that is, and I've said this to principals and teachers, is live streaming our classrooms. So if you can spread out into other places, you talked about using volunteers. There's a quality issue with that in terms of just making sure you can ensure the quality with people that you haven't properly trained yet. So I think the better idea is to move them across spaces, but still have the teacher teaching. So I equate it to if you go to a football game. You can go to a football game and you can watch the game, or you could sit home and watch the game. You're still seeing the same game. So what we've been doing for the last few months is not the same, even though we did a better job and quicker of turning around in the public schools. It's not the same as when we had real live classes. So I just think that's the truth. And I think what Paul said was a good point. What we did in the past doesn't constrain what we're going to do in the future. So I think we should go back to old-fashioned regular instruction. And then whoever can't be in that classroom, they might be in another part of the building, they might be in a parish hall, they might be sitting in their living room at home, just because of these rules that we have. They're getting the same instruction every single day. So the parents know, as a value proposition, that no matter where their kid is, they're getting the same instruction. They have the ability to answer questions. And if they're flat on their back sick for COVID or other reasons, that we're going to send them home links of all the instruction that occurred. And whenever they're able to, they can catch up. They won't have missed anything. That's not the same as sending packets home or doing checks in and all this other kind of stuff that we've been doing. And I appreciate all the effort that the teachers have done, and we've done much better than school districts have done. But I think we can do much higher quality instruction if we go back to teaching for full days. So I think the key is taking a population that in many cases, we have a lot of older people who are, I joke, are trying to get the light on the VCR to stop blinking. We have to get them to basically be at the level where somebody, a typical kid in 5th grade, is in terms of technology. So there's a generational challenge here.
Just to clarify, I don't necessarily believe that volunteers is the answer. I believe that actually you can hire and pay quality people who are really exceptional and have been part of various education innovations to do that and spread out your funding and probably increase and attract people because you're offering not just live streaming but true digital blended learning. So to be continued on that, but let's yeah.
Yeah, two other aspects that people have to consider as school leaders is I don't think parents are going to accept for a long period of time remote learning for really young kids. They're just not. They're not going to pay full tuition for, you know, a kid that just like can't sit there that long. And the socialization is a large part of their education. So what the smarter principals are doing is they're prioritizing the space within the building for kids that really can't do remote well, which is going to push out some kids in other grades who are higher who could do remote learning more easily. So it's a trade-off decision there. And I think that's something that people have to look at that. Similarly, I think people should prioritize live space for single moms, for example, or any household where the parents can't be at home. Because I don't see how parents pay tuition and then also pay for most parents childcare on top of it once they go back to work. Right. So you have to convince the other parents, obviously some parents are going to get pushed out by this, that there has to be a sense of community and a sense of mission of why we're doing this, because some people are going to be asked to make sacrifices on behalf of other people who need them to make sacrifices, whether it's a financial sacrifice or it's a sacrifice that your kid is doing raw remote time and another child, or we're taking a preference for the youngest and most vulnerable among us rather than the older kids who are more capable on their own. And I think we can make that case, but that case has to be made.
So we have two other questions. One, is the HEROES Act dead in the Senate? Who are the key influencers of how this legislation will be transformed with the feasibility of including parents who wish to send their children to Catholic and private schools? And then could you discuss, Tom, what you just laid out as a blended learning model? Has Boston or LA partnered with schools or organizations that are right now assisting in blended learning models?
So individual schools have worked with partners on a one-off basis, if you will. We have a completely decentralized system. So we give people guidance, we give people ideas, we give people technical assistance, access to vendors, but we don't do a one-size-fits-all. We have the Boston Archdiocese, second largest district in the state. It's the single largest district geographically. We span 144 different towns and cities. And so there's a great deal of variety within the Archdiocese. So we allow a great deal of flexibility within the schools. I don't know whether LA takes the same approach or not.
Yep. Yeah. Let me just give you an example of where I think our partnership, and I see more partnership. I don't see less. I think for everyone in the educational sector, we need more of each other than staying in our silos. That's between just within our own system as well. More and more collaboration. I find it to be extraordinarily empowering for leaders when they talk to other leaders and really get some great ideas and amplify. It becomes a force multiplier. So I'll give you a force multiplier example on a larger scale that we're, talking to Arizona State University, for example, that has done some great work in Phoenix and in Arizona around not only the charter school space, but also in terms of providing that early college model where kids in high schools are able to achieve transferable credits. Early stage right now, but we, as a result of not just this crisis, but even as I came in last year, very clearly wanting to show this stronger value proposition that high school diplomas is not enough, especially with the Catholic school legacy and promise that we deliver on. We need to deliver more. So where can we create economies of scale where we can scale up a partnership across our high schools to offer early college opportunities for all of our high school students, lower that cost per unit, increase value to that high school diploma, because college is now becoming high school. We need to create not just college prep schools, we need to create early college opportunities and transition into pathways into careers that are in high demand. And so industry partners come behind that because they see the value in having a ready-made workforce ready to go with kids who may already have a year or two under their belt. Can we do even better than that? I think we can, but it's going to take some work. It's going to take partnership. It's going to take a recognition that public-private partnerships, PPP, another acronym out there, is still an incredible way to leverage up and to create these force multipliers for kids. So I see that as being one example of an opportunity that we're seeing emerge.
I'm looking.
Can I go back to the HEROES Act, because we didn't really answer that question. I think it's an important one. I'm not a big fan of the education piece of the HEROES Act that came out of the House. So it clearly needs to be changed.
Define it for those people who don't know what it is.
Yeah, so basically what they did is they put aside the higher ed, so just the K-12 stuff. They put up $60 billion and no money going to non-public schools at all. And then they reached back into the CARES Act and then stripped the non-public piece out of the CARES Act, in which we were already in the process of getting money from that. So I think that was kind of an outrageous thing that clearly was designed, with the teachers' unions looking over their shoulder. The HEROES Act, so I think that Mitch McConnell has said the HEROES Act as it stands is dead in the US Senate. I don't think anyone's particular version is the Senate version, the House version, the White House version is going to go through. It's going to be a negotiated compromise. So the question is, who are the influencers? The influencers ultimately, I think, are the parents. The parents' voices have to be heard. It's senators, congressmen, and people in the White House, particularly the president. But they're heavily influenced, and this year more than any, because the country is so divided. There's so many parts of the country, so many districts, states, electoral map considerations that are all driven by very, very tight races. The House is afraid that they're going to have to give up a lot of the moderate seats they won in the last election. On the Senate side, there's a lot of Republicans up for U.S. Senate races. They're terrified about that. And the president obviously is in a race for his life. So I think for all of those reasons, people in both parties are going to be very sensitive to people speaking out. So in whatever form, whether it's making a call or eventually when they go back to candidate forums, you can weigh in, you should. In this case, to remind everybody, we have a very tight time frame. This is likely going to be decided in the next 4 weeks. So I would ask people, don't wait till the fall. We're trying to get help over the summer so we can make this a better fall for a lot of kids.
Great point, Tom. Great point, Paul. One of the things that we started this webinar with, and one thing we're going to bring about again, is the Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue case and Blaine. People need to reach out to their elected leaders in the House, in the Senate, in the executive branch. It would not help, or it would help immensely for you to call to governors, to your state legislators, to your state senators, to your county commissioners, whoever is in a position of influence to be able to make calls as well. We also had a comment that people need to look at the Florida model of scholarships and the tax credit scholarships, where 35% of the students are on scholarships, which saved the schools there. The Step Up for students still has scholarship funds in Florida for residents who qualify, and they have both systems in their diocese. They have parish schools and diocese-run schools, and the system works well.
Because they don't have as challenging of an amendment on their constitutional books, and that's the importance of the Blaine Amendment, is you can actually help support the choices of parents when your laws or your constitutionality are not compromised. It's really actually quite extraordinary.
Yeah, one of the issues in the federal debate on the relief bill is doing a scholarship tax credit. Secretary DeVos has proposed one. It's an issue that I've lobbied on for 8 years before I had this job, both in New York and DC, as Jeanne has as well. So for a very long time. So I think as a mechanism, the Florida program is the largest school choice program in the country. A lot more people are being served through scholarship tax credits than they are through vouchers or other kinds of programs. So I think that's a very promising idea. It doesn't solve the short-term relief that we need. But if we can get through this short-term crisis, a scholarship tax credit would create a glide path that would sustain choice within the educational space for a very long time.
Let me ask you guys one other question as we begin to wrap up. I think there are one or two other audience questions. I think most people here really do know the answer to this, but it is continuing to be a challenge. Even on Twitter yesterday, somebody made a comment about private schools being supported by the current CARES Act and the other federal stimulus programs. And there was a comment about people who go to private schools are wealthier. If you look at the data, it's like not true. We're not talking about Tony expensive private schools, right? We're talking about the $6,000-7,000 a year. How do we help people truly understand that if their only frame of reference is the hoity-toity private school down the street or something that they see in movies?
Right, sure. There's if you look at the non-public community, there are different segments to it, right? So you have the boarding schools at the kind of the highest tuition level, which can be in the $50,000 and $60,000 a year. And then you have day school, independent day schools that could be anywhere from the 20s up through the 30s, 40s, even higher in cities like New York City. But the Catholic market, that we directly control, if you will, the diocesan schools and the related schools are dramatically less expensive, and we serve a different market. And Cardinal Sean O'Malley in Boston says often that for most people, for most poor people, the surest ticket out of poverty is a Catholic school. And I think that's true. And as we're dealing with this time frame, with a lot of the racial strife that's going on, part of that is drawn by the kind of the inequities, start with the inequities in educational opportunity. And Catholic schools, the word Catholic, as you know, literally means universal. And so we are, unlike a lot of other faiths, we take all comers. We educate all people. We educate them because we're Catholic, not because they're Catholic. Faith is a strong part of what we do, but we take people of other faiths into our schools and we take them in open arms. When we run, the Catholic Church runs soup kitchens. When we have missionary, you can't go to anywhere the poor are served anywhere in the world and not run into a Catholic missionary right there, boots on the ground. So this is part of the social mission of the church from inception, is to serve the poor and the marginalized and to give them a hand up. And so we have a unique position. We have the largest footprint of any church when it comes to charitable help around the world for the poor. And our schools are uniquely open to everybody. So I think people need to understand that we spend a tremendous amount of money trying to make sure that we can reach poor and working class and sure middle class families as well. And as part of the social mission of the church.
Actually, we've had a great, I'm sorry, Paul, go ahead.
Just really quickly to add, in American pop culture, we've popularized the Catholic school sort of meme. With the angry nun with the ruler, and whether it's the Blues Brothers or you name the sort of popular sentiment. Americans generally know what Catholic schools are. They probably know it through different lenses, some good, some maybe not so good, depending on their own personal history with it. But the bottom line is that we need to organize, and we need to organize in a way that we've never done so before. Having spent years advocating and leading the charter school network, working for the California Charter Schools Association, activating hundreds of thousands of families and kids and teachers and principals in a very, very clear and compelling way to put pressure on political forces is part of the fabric of the charter school community. We can learn a lot from them. They've learned a lot from us. They certainly have. And to a large degree, they've been very successful in providing to a general population this idea of a kind of Catholic light. We don't do religion here, but we'll have the discipline, we'll have the focus, the achievement, all of these things on the public dollar, the bank, right? And so what can we learn? We eat a lot of humble pie, and be very candid. And I think that we need to stop doing that, and we need to start activating our community in a way that we maybe haven't before. May not be in our nature, may not be how we like to do business, but the game has changed. And if this does come down to our ability to thrive in the future, then we need to activate those voices. Parents, families, leaders, and not just hit the send button on the email, but get out on your feet and make sure that our elected officials know that when our parents go to the voting booth, they're going to be thinking about them and thinking about where they're at on these things. This is a level of political activism the Catholic Church does know in other areas when it comes to right to life and other social issues. I think we need to apply the same kind of political force in the area of Catholic education. I think that's when we will start to see responsiveness.
And I think your pastors have to be hearing that message. I know we have some on today. I think pastors traditionally have not loved having a school. It's kind of a headache. We've heard that over time. You guys can take the headache off of them because you are organizing yourselves just the way the independent mission schools in Philadelphia and many, many other network hybrids. But there does have to be, to your point, Paul, a lot more demand in the larger community and a lot more grassroots. And toolkits. Somebody's asking about, can we get this in bulleted form? Can we get something out? There's lots and lots of that kind of stuff, but we're so diffuse, we're so independent, we're so like reformers just generally are. We don't all get in a room together and say, let's march. And so we do have to kind of drop our level of independence to a certain extent and recognize that we can in fact help the kids who need it most get the education they deserve. I also think, Paul and Tom, to your earlier point, charters, traditional publics that have innovative leaders want you all to succeed. They want to see great schools serving students. They want to see that universal delivery. And so it really is, I think, incumbent upon everyone participating today. We've had an extraordinary response to this. It is taped, so we will be sharing it. We're also going to take the audio and put it on a podcast so we can continue the conversation. And Paul and Tom, I'll just ask you as a last question, unless Michael has something else. Are there a lot more of you out there like yourselves who are thoughtful, innovative, strong, understand the importance of advocacy, and are working really hard to keep your schools open?
Well, I think in my case, I would say, and I think Paul's, I think both of us in different ways, we've had different lives. But both of us are somewhat unconventional candidates. We've done a lot of diverse things before showing up to the job. And so I think that's becoming much more common among superintendents because the skill set that it takes to run a system in these times is more than simply just the education background. So people who have substantial nonprofit experience, people who have some advocacy experience in the background. Skills that I had from my past that I didn't think were relevant to the job are suddenly relevant to the job. So I think more and more cardinals and bishops are being mindful of that. And I think they're not that they will choose unconventional candidates every time, but I think the search process in a lot of dioceses is becoming much more open than it used to be.
Agreed.
Last word, Paul?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that this environment requires a whole host of diversified skill sets and experiences, and there are many others who don't have the honor and privilege of being out front and advocating in this way. I see my job as a servant leader is amplifying their voices. Those voices are on the ground every single day, thinking about how they can ensure that kids are getting the level of care and attention and achievement that all families want, all people want for their kids. Part of the American promise, part of the American dream, and being able to come to this country as my grandparents did. All they wanted was to ensure that the next generation would have it a bit better than they did. And as that dream and that promise becomes compromised, it's not going to be, it's not going to come down to small means. We can't bite around the edges on this. We really have to address it at its core, fundamentally. Follow the money. Where the money flows, you will ultimately have the answers. So I think we need to really fundamentally change the game, the way that we fund education in America.
Well, Mother Cabrini brought a generation of immigrants into American society and made them incredibly successful, including my mother. So I am grateful to you both. I'm grateful to her. And I would urge everyone on this call, again, particularly the philanthropists, to do everything they can over the next few months to prop up not just schools, but the advocacy, so that it might be the last time you have to make that Band-Aid. So thank you so much again, Paul Escala, Superintendent of LA Diocese, Tom Carroll, Superintendent Boston Catholic Schools, and all of you for joining me, my colleague, Michael Musante. Please let us know how we can help you. Continue to send your questions. Let's work together to continue to raise and elevate the critical notion of educational opportunity. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
You too, and thank you for your leadership.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeanne. Thank you, Michael.